This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, across Bloomberg platforms. Welcome to Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Carol Massar, Tim Stenivek, live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Hey, who would have thunk? January 15th, and big tech is back.
Yeah, TSMC can really be the one to take a bow today. I think it really is setting the tone for the entire market. It's an AI bellwether, and that outlook is really what has people talking. I think the magical number is $52 to $56 billion.
Yeah.
25% increase, and certainly in what it thinks it's going to spend on CapEx compared to last year.
Yeah.
Giving a lift to the entire tech space today.
Sounds pretty impressive. And I'm looking at an S&P 500. Looks like an intraday high here. So we could be on track for a record close. All right. More on the trade in just a moment, though. Coming up this hour, I got to say, where to begin? Putting our call this morning, we're like, okay, how do we put into perspective that Amazon is buying into a copper mine? You've got that. You've got the White House's move to reduce the U.S. and its allies' dependence on Chinese critical minerals. A lot more happening when it comes to the global race, war, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to the grab for raw and critical minerals. So we're going to try and unpack that and make sense of it all.
Also, today's big bank earnings, of course, and a record AUM for BlackRock as it reports its quarterly results. Also, a redhead crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Speaking of the big banks, Goldman has named BlackRock's Amanda Lynham as its chief credit strategist. That redhead just crossing the Bloomberg.
That talent shift, if you will, or changes as we kick off this new year of 2026. All right, lots coming your way in the next 60 minutes. Let's get a check on that trading session, check out what's going on. Over to Charlie Pellet we go. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Good afternoon to you both. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. Big tech rallying. Right now, we have got the S&P up 43, 69.69 where we stand. The record, the old closing high, 69.77. That's set on Monday for the S&P. Right now, looking at a gain of 43 points, up 0.6%. The Dow up 0.8%. NASDAQ, meanwhile, also up by 0.8%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares outperforming. That index up now by 1.3%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 index up 0.7%. The 10-year at 4.15%. The 2-year 3.55%. Gold is down $8 the ounce to $46.18. Drop there of 0.2%. A retreat for silver still at $92.43. That is dropping now by 0.8%. West Texas Intermediate crude back below 60, 59.12 right now on WTI. We've got crude down by 4.7%, and Bitcoin down almost 2%, 95,675. Carol and Tim talked about those bank earnings. After earnings, we got Goldman Sachs up now by 4.8%. Morgan Stanley after earnings up 5.8%, and BlackRock up right now by about 5.9%. Some of the other stories that we're following: JP Morgan Chase has formed a new quantitative trading and research group in a bid to speed up its efforts in electronic trading and fend off non-bank rivals. Again, JP Morgan Chase up now by 1%. So recapping, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. Could see a record close today on the S&P. And again, repeating that headline, Goldman Sachs naming BlackRock's Amanda Lynham as chief credit strategist. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, and as we mentioned, we're going to be talking about BlackRock's quarterly results a little bit later on this hour. Let's get to something that I think it's safe to say, Tim, it was kind of a wait what moment a little bit this morning, and this had to do with Amazon Web Services striking a deal with Rio Tinto Group to use copper from an Arizona mine in U.S. data centers. It made us say, why Amazon, why copper, and then in the back of our minds, we're like, we kind of know what's going on.
Well, to break it all down for us and really lay it out, Bloomberg News senior commodities reporter James Attwood joins us from Bloomberg's Santiago, Chile bureau. James, good to have you on the program. This is for AWS. We understand. Well, we don't understand everything about what goes into these data centers, and I think we're understanding more and more thanks to your reporting. But what exactly is Amazon going to be doing with this copper?
Well, what we've seen from the statement, and the statement doesn't have a lot of detail, there's no commercial terms there, but they're going to use copper produced by this new technology from a unit of Rio Tinto to in components of US data centers. So obviously it's a cloud-based data and analytics. So copper is used. Copper's the wiring metal. It's used in lots of conventional uses in building, construction, plumbing, but it's also a big part of everything from, obviously electricity grids and renewable energy to electric cars. And now one of the big new drivers is everything to do with artificial intelligence, including data centers.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen, what's interesting, we've been watching what's going on with copper, in the copper trade in terms of the metals market, and we have seen it ease from an all-time high. Markets taking stock of kind of what we've seen as a record rally as of late, and we're just trying to understand speculators versus demand. There are in this story, and we've been talking about some of the demand and draw that's expected on copper specifically longer term. What are we hearing? I think it's S&P. Is it S&P Global that came out with some new forecasts?
Right. So, like most assets, you've got the shorter term situation, which is more to do with flows of copper going into the US ahead of possible tariffs, as well as some supply disruptions. But beyond that, underpinning all these fairly bullish forecasts is basically the inability, or the perceived inability, of the supply side to keep up with demand. And part of the demand growth, a big part of the demand growth, is coming from data centers, artificial intelligence infrastructure. And you referred to S&P Global report. Their numbers have global installed data center capacity increasing by almost fourfold over the next couple of decades. And so that means demand from AI, data centers, and defense spending, I think they group it in as well, will roughly triple. That's demand for copper, roughly triple by 2040. So that's adding 4 million tons of consumption, new consumption to the market.
The supply chain side of this for what goes into high tech is not anything new. I mean, we have Apple for years publishing where it gets certain minerals and elements from. I think of Tesla and the cobalt and the lithium refining that Tesla has set up in recent years as an attempt to take over more control. Is that what Amazon is doing right now, or are they still at the point where they're just, okay, we're just buying it directly from this company, we're not taking this into our control at all?
Well, no, I think it's right. It's part of a trend, or at least the beginning of a possible trend. You've got, as you say, Amazon coming in basically on an off-take agreement. This production isn't available yet. It's still being developed. They're deploying this industrial scale leaching technology at this particular mine in Arizona. So Amazon has agreed to buy a chunk of that supply, as well as providing support, helping Rio Tinto improve the technology. You mentioned Apple. Apple's come in a similar kind of arrangement, although they put up money, $500 million, to a rare earth magnet project in Texas. That's MP Materials is the company behind that. And then, as you say, Tesla, they've also come in. They've got an offtake agreement, a multi-year sales agreement for lithium at Piedmont Lithium project in North Carolina. So, you've got the tech companies coming in as offtakers, which is relatively new. Typically, the big offtakers who put up money for these projects are trading houses or other more traditional buyers of these minerals.
Hey, James, just 30 seconds here. I mean, to see this, like we said, we woke up and we're like, wait, what's going on here? But it does make sense. We understand what's going on. We understand the AI build out and all that's needed for data centers as well. Does this mean, though, you talked about supply demand metrics, just quickly, maybe in the short term, maybe in the medium term, there is going to be a bit of a shortage when it comes to copper, maybe already, and that is going to put pressure on prices?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how much of it is already factored in, I'm not sure, but certainly if you just look at the demand projections, it's supposed to increase, according to S&P Global anyway, by about 50% from current levels by about 2040. But S&P are predicting that supply will peak in 2030, that unless something changes, unless there are new technologies like the one that Rio Tinto is trying to develop, or unless recycling becomes a bigger deal, or unless many more billions of dollars are invested into new projects, then the supply side won't be able to keep up, and there'll be a gap, basically. Of course, it's hypothetical.
Right.
If the copper doesn't exist, it can't be consumed, but that's certainly an interesting metric to look at.
All right, good stuff. James, thank you so much. James Attwood, Bloomberg News senior commodities reporter, joining us from our Santiago, Chile bureau. All right, we're going to stay on the critical and raw materials grab that's going on around the globe. A couple of things going on, Tim. We have the U.S. convening or planning to convene dozens of foreign officials, really foreign ministers from allied countries next month. They're looking to pursue an agreement designed to help reduce their dependencies on Chinese critical minerals.
Yeah, the meeting, people familiar with it say, is slated for February 4th. It's going to be focused on diversifying and fortifying supply chains for critical minerals. It's expected to be hosted by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The U.S. has also been pressing some EU member states to sign bilateral memoranda of understanding to help reduce reliance on Chinese critical materials.
Right. Meantime, you've got silver pulling back from a record high as investors took profits after a blistering rally, and as the U.S. refrained from imposing import tariffs on critical minerals. And so just want to mention, should we mention some of these headlines? President Trump.
Everything is related.
It's like someone's listening to us. President Trump to lower tariffs to 15% on goods from Taiwan. Taiwan pledges $250 billion each in chip investment and credit guarantees. So this is certainly, it all kind of flows together.
Okay, so we did plan to talk to Michael Shepard, senior editor for technology and strategic industries for Bloomberg News, about critical minerals and what the U.S. is doing. And we will do that. But Mike, first I want to just get your thoughts on this breaking news that we're seeing cross. I know you haven't really gotten a chance to see it until we have, but the president said to lower tariffs to 15% on goods from Taiwan, Taiwan pledging $250 billion each in chip investment credit guarantees. What's your response? What's your reaction?
Well, this is a deal that has been taking shape for months between the self-governed island and the United States. It's been a top priority for officials there in Taipei, but also here in Washington, because Taiwan is such a crucial source of the chips that go into artificial intelligence and AI data centers across the U.S. and around the world. And they wanted to make sure they get this locked into place and that they can have some assurance that supply lines to the island are really in a good place, and that the island feels like it is on par with its regional neighbors, Japan and South Korea, which also have been a big source of electronics, including chips, to the U.S., but have already agreed to trade pacts with the Trump administration. Now, under this, we've reported previously that the deal would include, it's not in the White House memo, but we reported earlier this week that the deal would include Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company agreeing to build as many as 4 additional plants beyond the 6 factories that it has promised to build here in the U.S. Over the next several years, along with 2 packaging facilities. So we're talking about a lot of investment here, Tim, and this is something that officials in Taiwan have been looking for, but it runs the risk, of course, of antagonizing China.
Yeah, we're getting some more information on this. The U.S. and Taiwan agreeing to a trade agreement that would lower tariffs on goods from Taiwan to 15% and see TSMC increase financing for American operations. Taiwanese semiconductor companies. Taiwan's tech industry would commit to making at least $250 billion in direct investments to expand semiconductor energy and AI ops in the U.S., and provide Carol an additional $250 billion in credit guarantees.
You know, Mike, I wonder, I think about the U.S. and China, man. This is frenemies to the, 10th degree or whatever you want to call it. I mean, we've got the president, right, heading to meet President Xi in China. I'm not quite sure the date on that. I think it's in April that's supposed to happen. But I think about that and what's happening, this deal with Taiwan and not looking to maybe antagonize China. But then you've also got we kicked off in the introduction to you that the U.S. is convening dozens of foreign ministers from allied countries next month to look into and pursue an agreement designed to help reduce their dependencies on Chinese critical minerals. I mean, this relationship, as I feel like the U.S., China, Europe, these regions are trying to make sure they have an access to raw materials, critical minerals for their own national security.
Well, the Taiwan trade deal and the agreements that have been forged with trading partners around the world, and this effort to try to lock down rare earth supplies outside China really just show the competition between the world's two largest economies, the U.S. and China, and just how officials in Washington and Beijing are, while they are trying to work together, they are really in competition with each other just as much. And they are each trying to gain an advantage, not only economically in the broad sense, but very specifically when it comes to these areas of advanced technology, especially artificial intelligence and all the ingredients like advanced semiconductors and, yes, the rare earths that help to produce them.
You know, the other tricky relationship, Mike, as you know, is U.S. and Europe right now, or U.S. and its NATO allies. So I'm just curious what you make or the significance of the U.S. looking to meet with its allies kind of against China when it comes to critical minerals. Like, it's just interesting. Like, I need this massive whiteboard to understand the things that people get along with geopolitically and that they don't get along with the same people or same countries.
Well, Carol, I think we all need that massive whiteboard to follow all the ebbs and flows in the saga, and especially with Europe, the idea that they would try to convene all of these ministers from so many countries comes at a curious time because of all the tensions over the U.S. interest in taking control of Greenland.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned this because that's exactly where my head was going.
Yes, and Tim, that really is the stakes of the game when it comes to Greenland. The U.S. has in mind the rare earths and critical minerals deposits there as something that could be extracted. It's, of course, also a strategic security play when it comes to the military angle, but you cannot overlook at all just what it means in terms of rare earths and the conversation right now.
What's your take on this? Is this the quote art of the deal at work here, where the U.S. and the Trump administration sort of goes to the most extreme measure for something it wants, and then the deal that ends up being struck is something that is much more benign, something that's much more traditional?
And that's another question, Tim, that we are struggling to answer right now. And I think even officials on both sides of the Atlantic are trying to get their heads around what is the end game for the president and his closest advisors? How far do they want to take it? There are certainly some who simply want to acquire Greenland by force if necessary, but otherwise by purchasing it if they can. Now, of course, if you ask officials from Denmark and from Greenland, the answer is a resounding no. They want no part of that. They wouldn't be opposed to expanding the strategic and business partnership and ties that they have with the U.S., but not under those terms. It's unclear, though, just what the extent of this deal-making is. There was a meeting on Monday with some German officials who walked away really uncertain and a bit dismayed by what they heard from Trump officials, and the Danish, when they were here to talk about Greenland later in the week, this week, they too came away with the sense that there remain fundamental differences between their government's view and the U.S.
I think the world should just take a vacation, maybe a month off. Just
Do
saying.
We get a month off too?
Take a break. Everybody take a pause. Great stuff, as always. Mike Shepard, thank you so much. Senior Editor for Technology and Strategic Industries at Bloomberg News. Coming up, there's a lot going on at the White House, as Mike just laid out. We're going to dig a little bit deeper and go into some domestic issues as well.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks pushing higher. In fact, very close to our record, 69.67, where the S&P stands right now. The record just 10 points away. Right now, the S&P pushing higher. Tech rally underway with the S&P up 40, up 0.6%. The Dow up 421 now on the Dow, a gain of 0.9%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index up 168 points. For NASDAQ, that is a gain right now of 7 0.7%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares, the outperformer now, up by 1.4%. Our Mag 7 index up 0.5%. The 10-year currently yielding 4.15%, with the 2-year 3.55%. Gold down $7 the ounce, 46.19, drop there of 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 4.6%, 59.18 a barrel. Cannot ignore silver, tumbling now by 0.3%, still very close to $93 the ounce. And Bitcoin down 1.8%, 95,770 on Bitcoin. President Trump's going to be lowering tariffs to 15% on goods from Taiwan. That headline moments ago on the Bloomberg. And Ford says there is an urgent need to update the North American Free Trade Agreement, critical to the region's automotive industry, a sharp contrast to comments by President Trump this week expressing indifference toward brokering a new deal. And this morning, Bloomberg's Matt Miller sat down with the Ford executive chairman, Bill Ford, to talk about the automaker's history of prioritizing the United States.
We're going to build here, and we're going to build in our hometown of Detroit, Michigan, and in Michigan. But we're going to build elsewhere in America. And as I say, that was something that was important to me, even though we paid a price for it. And that was long before anybody ever talked about tariffs.
Ford Executive Chairman Bill Ford speaking with Bloomberg's Matt Miller in Detroit. By the way, you can watch the full conversation on YouTube on the Bloomberg podcast channel. Ford shares, they are down little change right now, down under 0.1%. Were you affected by that Verizon outage yesterday? Verizon now says it will be issuing $20 credits to customers affected by a widespread service outage, which it attributes to a, quote, software issue. Verizon today down 0.8%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up 39, up by about 0.6%. And for on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
How are you going to spend that $20?
I think it's a credit, so I think it. I tried to make a couple.
Maybe
calls.
make some extra calls.
I tried to make a couple calls yesterday, and I got this message that the Verizon customer is not available. Were you affected by this?
No, I was not. I don't know what my service is anymore. We've been bouncing around. I don't know.
Maybe you were just on Wi-Fi the whole time. You didn't leave the building, so you're good.
You asked me questions I have no answers for.
That's okay. That's
All
okay.
Right. A lot of things that we don't have answers for. There's a lot going on in the nation's capital. President Trump threatened to deploy U.S. military forces to Minnesota to quell protests in response to violent encounters involving federal immigration agents. We're talking about ICE agents. This is one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg today. The president also, on another topic, I should say, telling Reuters that he faulted Ukraine's leader Volodymyr Zelensky as the main obstacle to an agreement to end the war that Russia launched against his country. And then we just talked about with Mike Shepard, the pursuit of Greenland. Yeah,
there's a lot. And here to help make sense of it all is Bloomberg News White House editor Jordan Fabian. He joins us from Washington, D.C., from the Bloomberg News Bureau there. What would you say is the focus of the White House and the president right now? And look, we're always hearing from politicians they can do two things at once. They can, so-called walk and chew gum at the same time. But what seems to be the focus of the president?
Well, this president is an interesting one in that he is less single-minded in that he rolls from kind of one controversy to the next. But hanging over all of the tumult right now is the midterm elections in November. The president is very keen not to lose control of Congress. He himself said if that happens, Democrats can try to impeach him for a third time. So if you look at all the moves he's trying to make, whether it's in Minnesota or overseas, he's certainly trying to essentially assert power and control over perceived enemies in an effort to display that he's still in charge as a lame duck president whose term runs out in just a few years.
Jordan, is that what all this foreign policy or foreign, actions outside the United States and focus, whether it's Iran, whether it's the war between Russia and Ukraine, whether it's the Middle East? I mean, is that Venezuela? Is that what this is all about? To show the power of the U.S., the power of the presidential office, the power of President Trump's presidential office ahead of midterms?
It's power and leverage. He doesn't believe in the post-World War II order that the U.S. helped underwrite, that relied on multinational institutions and not launching wars of aggression and attacks on sovereign countries. He's saying that the U.S. is an unrivaled superpower and should act like it, especially in the Western Hemisphere, where you saw him strike Venezuela, take out Nicolas Maduro from power, and also try to make this grab on Greenland. He's saying essentially we're going to take these places for the resources and the materials that we need and try and stop us.
Well, it's interesting that we're talking Greenland here and we're talking impeachment because Representative Don Bacon, he's a Republican of Nebraska. He was out earlier this week, and I'm reading from USA Today right now. He told the Omaha World Herald that the president's approach to Greenland is, quote, utter buffoonery. And he said, if he went through with the threats, I think it would be the end of his presidency. So the president making comments that he's concerned if Democrats get control, then he could be impeached. But Republicans aren't necessarily on board with everything this president is doing right now.
Yeah, you're right, Tim. It's a very notable trend is that the president entered office with essentially unquestioned power and control over the Republican-held Congress, where he saw little resistance, whether it was to his tariffs or his effort to steamroll through that one big beautiful bill last year. This year, it's a different story. You're seeing Republicans hold up opposition to him on the Epstein files, on this Greenland threat, on the war powers resolution that we saw sink narrowly in the Senate with regard to Venezuela, but something that wouldn't have necessarily gone that far in a Republican-controlled Congress last year. And so, I think Republicans are thinking about their own reelection races. They see this president losing popularity among the public, according to polls, and they're trying to insulate themselves from all the chaos and the damage that he's wrought.
Jordan, what happened to the affordability focus, it felt like, at the end of last year that we started to hear from the White House?
Yeah, that's interesting, Carol, because affordability is so intrinsically linked to Republican success in the midterm, and yet the president seems to struggle to stay focused on that issue. He doesn't seem to find it as interesting as things like these foreign adventures in Greenland and Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, and also renovation projects of the White House, from the East Wing to his effort to gain control over Washington, D.C.'s municipal golf courses. All these things have caught Trump's eye more than this affordability push. So you've seen him do some speeches here and there. He's gone to Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Detroit just this week, but it's not the consistent focus of his message.
Well, and that brings me to another question that Tim and I have been thinking a lot about. What is not getting attention, not in the headlines, but should be perhaps, and that is super important. And it brings us to what's going on in Minnesota. And certainly in the headlines, but I'm just thinking it's a lot every day if you look at what comes out from the White House, the president specifically, when it comes to social media. And certainly this was part
it's like the whole
of
idea
kind of the early dump.
Quote unquote flooding the zone.
Exactly.
With what we saw from Steve Bannon in the first Trump administration.
Exactly.
Yeah, it certainly is part and parcel of that, and it is a continuation of his effort to assert control over democratic states and cities. And I think people like Steve Bannon would relish in the imagery that we're seeing of federal agents clashing on the street with protesters to try and depict Trump's opposition as this extreme left-wing presence. But obviously the shooting that was involved the local resident there, the U.S. citizen woman last week, the shooting last night, it's an interesting dynamic because that played for Trump in the 2024 midterms, but now he's in charge, and all these images of chaos on American streets are happening with him as president. And so, and Americans don't seem to be seeing it the same way that they did last year when they voted Joe Biden out of office.
But that is what's interesting is I think, ultimately you do have a president who says what he thinks is right, and sometimes follows through with an executive order or some kind of policy. But we've seen him soften. We saw it with the tariffs, right? And when the markets came undone, he rolled back, and we continue to see more negotiations that are easier, if you will, on other countries and certainly for the U.S. economy. But I do wonder with this issue, why does he necessarily, I think he keeps kind of escalating the military presence in Minnesota. Why does he feel that this is what Americans want? Is it what Americans want?
It's not so much about what Americans want, but it's about what he wants. And this presidency is
even if it hurts his polling?
he certainly thinks it's the right thing for him at this time, and he seems to be focused solely at this point on his legacy and doing these pet projects. And it's also important to remember that this push is also fueled by Stephen Miller, who's arguably his most influential advisor, who sees these culture war issues, immigration, as the battle lines that he wants to draw in the White House. And so that's why you've seen such a heavily militarized, aggressive presence in enforcing immigration laws and confronting these liberal protesters on the streets.
Jordan, I know you mentioned the president's being concerned about polling and also Republicans being concerned about polling. It takes a few days to get polling results, but do we understand how the United States as a whole or general groups of the United States feel when they see the imagery come out of a city such as Minneapolis, when they see federal agents on the streets clashing with protesters? Do we have any sort of data about that yet?
I haven't seen good data on that yet, but if you look at polling last year, that it's measured his decision to deploy National Guard troops to cities like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Chicago. It didn't poll very well. It wasn't among his least popular moves, but Americans are wary of the presence of active duty military troops on the streets, who aren't necessarily schooled in domestic law enforcement carrying out those functions. And so, it sort of heightens, I think, for a lot of people, the sense of unease. For other people, they might like it. They think that crime in their cities or towns are out of control. They need it, but certainly the majority doesn't support it.
Jordan, just got about 45 seconds here. I think safe to say that a lot of folks, when we watch some of the live press events in the Oval Office, it is remarkable, President Trump, his ability to address a variety of topics, even if the event is about one thing. And he certainly seems informed, certainly has an opinion, and certainly puts things out there. So having said that, there is a lot that seems to come at us even more than usual in terms of things from the White House, whether it's social media or strategies or news stories that affect the markets, affect investments, affect geopolitics. Is it a focused White House? I mean, you guys are there in and out. How does it feel in this second year of the Trump second White House? And just got, forgive me, about 25 seconds.
I would say last year it definitely seemed more focused in the beginning with the Elon Musk Doge efforts and his tariff push. Like that all seemed sort of in a directional way. But now, especially after the Epstein Files fiasco, things seem to be unraveling a little bit over there at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. All
right, great roundup. Jordan, thank you so much. Jordan Fabian, Bloomberg News White House editor. Still ahead. Did you forget we had bank earnings today?
Oh, I have not forgotten.
Yeah. And the stocks,
that's what we're doing next.
Yeah, stocks are moving. We'll break it down. What you need to know about Goldman, Morgan, also BlackRock.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ are all advancing. S&P, though, well off session highs. Right now, 69.58. The old record there, 69.77 for a while. Did look like we were very close to a new record, but right now we are looking at stocks that are off their session highs. The Dow up 361, up 0.7. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 0.5%. The NASDAQ 100 index now up by 0.6%. The 10-year 4.15%, with a 2-year 3.56%. Gold down 0.2%. Bitcoin down 2.2%. Bitcoin at 95,362. And by the way, West Texas Intermediate crude 59.13 a barrel, down now by 4.7%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, got it, Charlie. Thank you so much. So looking at shares of Goldman Sachs, up about 4.5%. And then let me bring up Morgan Stanley on the Bloomberg. It's up almost 5.7%, so almost 6%. So surging, both following earnings this morning. You had Goldman blowing through expectations for equities trading revenue, posting an all-time Wall Street record of $4.31 billion in the final 3 months of last year. Morgan Stanley's debt bankers increased revenue 93% in the fourth quarter, by far the biggest jump on Wall Street, capping a record year for that business. Sounds pretty good, Tim.
It does sound pretty good. And look at the way that the investment community is responding right now. With what you need to know, Bloomberg News Chief Wall Street Correspondent Sridhar Natarajan joins us in the studio. We're going to talk about what Carol just mentioned, but I think what both of us are interested in
David Solomon.
is what David Solomon said about prediction markets on this call. This was really fascinating to me. He's met with, in the last couple of weeks, he said he's met with the leaders of the two leading prediction markets platforms, Polymarket and Kalshi.
Is what we'll assume.
Is what we think?
Unless we have no idea of how the rankings work.
Okay, I'm just thinking in my head like, that would be logical. Why?
Well, it is fascinating, right? When you just think about the prediction market space, which is just betting markets, if you had to really simplify it, and how it has gone from the shadows to the mainstream now. You don't have to go that far back. 15 months ago, the FBI was knocking down the door of Polymarket CEO Shane Copeland. Since then, a platform that was banned in the US has seen all its legal troubles disappear, is making a big splash in the US. Kalshi is already there, and there is just a much greater embrace of these platforms, especially as they get into the sports wagers. The question for us is, on Wall Street, what is the value to this? And if you talk to a lot of executives out there, they point or at least they paint a picture that tells you that this could be a platform that has very interesting benefits. If you see institutional investors jump into the space, tomorrow you could see some of these wagers acting like a good tool to hedge your positions, because the bets right now are, will Joe Biden make a gaffe before the end of the month? Or will Donald Trump tell us how whole milk is spelled again before the end of March?
Will Tim eat a banana during Bloomberg Businessweek Daily?
But will you know? Because I'm going to do it and nobody will know.
Only if I say it.
Exactly.
Well, my point is, 6 months later, it could very well be, will the unemployment rate inch up? Will the Fed cut rates by 25 basis points or 50 basis points? And then when it becomes derivatives that are regulated by CFTC, you know you can attract institutional investors, and then what's the difference? You can make it behave like any other financial instrument these people are used to, and when that's the case, you can see why people like Goldman Sachs are interested, and perhaps other market makers like Citadel Securities has been out there talking about how there could be value to a tool like this.
Well, as you were talking about the challenges that at least Polymarket and its founder faced in the last 2 years or so, it just occurred to me, the New York Times has a story out about how both Kalshi and Polymarket have this commonality, and it's that Donald Trump Jr. is an advisor to both companies.
Okay, so interesting.
Yeah, it's just interesting.
No, it is. Listen, I was thinking, was David Solomon watching the Golden Globes? Because Polymarket was a part of that broadcast, and talk about having a global audience. So I'm curious that there are concerns about transparency. There are concerns about insider trading or, manipulation. Would a Goldman owning one of these platforms make it perhaps more legitimate?
You're thinking owning?
Owning one of these platforms.
Well, they already have a partnership with one of them.
I'm just saying that if they were involved, these are smart firms. They understand regulation in a big way. They remember the financial crisis in a big way. So careful.
So two things. You
guys both came at me.
Sorry.
What I'm really trying to figure out is, when the Goldman Sachs or say eventually a Citadel Securities or Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan get into this space, are they looking at partnerships with the Polymarkets and Kalshis? They are the rails and then run their trades on those systems, or could they actually be a competing product? That's one thing I would like to figure out. But also what we cannot forget is what David Solomon said towards the end of his comments, which is, while it's good to be all excited about it and all the pundits are talking about it, this kind of change and embrace will take time. So don't get too impatient. So it's not something you're expecting to see in 6 months, especially for the challenges you mentioned, because there are questions about transparency. There are questions about the rules-based system we have on these platforms. Those need to evolve. Those need to become more standardized. That is when you can get the biggest financial institutions to play.
All right, we got to run. Sorry. But we know there'll be more on this.
Oh, there will be.
Sri, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Bloomberg News Chief Wall Street Correspondent Sridhar Natarajan joining us right here in studio. We're going to stay on financials. We got to talk a little bit about BlackRock, because it pulled in $342 billion of total client cash in the fourth quarter, pushing the firm to a record $14 trillion of assets as it integrates a string of recent acquisitions to become a force in private markets. We want to dig a little bit deeper into their results.
Shares up 6% right now, following BlackRock over at CFRA Research's Cathy, Seifert, Senior Vice President and Equity Analyst of CFRA Research. She joins us from New Jersey. Shares rallying big time. Highlights for the quarter, what were they?
Well, I think one of the things to take away from the quarter was the breadth of the strength this quarter. You mentioned that asset inflows were $342 billion. Equity ETFs kind of paced that rise, but they also had fixed income inflows, alternative asset inflows. And so, I think the thing that encourages me, and I have a buy recommendation on the stock, was the breadth of the strength this quarter.
So specifically, okay, because it's interesting how much they, Cathy, are transforming themselves, right? Stocks, bonds, public markets, into one of the largest firms when it comes to private credit and infrastructure markets globally. Private markets, I'm just curious about that impact. What read-through did you get on that and kind of where it's going?
There had been some criticism that perhaps they might be late to this party, that maybe they overpaid for some of their acquisitions. I've kind of heard, some of that chatter. But I think the results this quarter should offer a little bit of relief to those who were worried about that, because, all of the firms that they acquired certainly contributed to the quarter and to the quarter's asset inflows. And then the technology, Aladdin and Preqin also posted significantly higher revenues as those systems are becoming more and more embedded in this ecosystem, if you will.
Well, speaking of that ecosystem, Citigroup is kind of part of that ecosystem. And I think this is really interesting, kind of an outsourcing deal. Citigroup handing BlackRock about $80 billion in the bank's wealthy clients' investment assets to manage. How big a deal is this for that firm? And are more deals like this to come?
That was a pretty typical deal, if you will. And again, also encouraging because BlackRock had in previous quarters lost some mandates. So it's nice to see not only, retail inflows, but large institutional deals like the Citi deal. And so it was just another component of what was a really strong, solid, and encouraging quarter.
Yeah, and we certainly see it in the share price as we continue to watch this stock trade. Really some outperformance in today's session. Cathy, thanks so much. Cathy Seifert, Senior Vice President, Equity Analyst over at CFRA Research, joining us on this Thursday. Hey, when we come back, a check on the trading day. We've got stocks off their best levels of the session. We were talking about the possibility of a record close on the S&P. We'll see whether we get there. Up about 0.5%. We've got a NASDAQ 100, Tim, just up about 0.6%.
Energy under a little bit of pressure today. Healthcare down about 0.5 percentage point. Communication services down 0.4%. But utilities, they are surging higher, up by 1.3%. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.